Imagine this. You are the captain of a Cobra-class destroyer as a part of a planetary naval cordon to a shrine world. You have been advised that forces of the great enemy are attempting to send cultists to the planet to desecrate holy sites and convert the people. In fact, instances of small cells planetside have been recorded, which lead to the flotilla you're in being deployed here. Your mission is to stem the tide of ships attempting to smuggle cultists in, preventing friendly forces on the planet from being overwhelmed with an ever-increasing cultist presence. It's here where your Auspex officer notifies you that they have picked up a signature of a cargo hauler. The speed and heading tells you this hauler has a modified engine and they're making a beeline for the planet, and so far have made no attempt to hell you. Your comms officer confirms with those planetside this ship is not an expected vessel. You don't attempt to contact the ship. You don't radio the commodore of the flotilla for direction. You simply order your weapons officer to gather a firing solution and open fire on the ship. Your macro cannons strike home and the hauler comes to a stop. It's clear the hauler isn't destroyed and it seems there's still a surviving crew on board. You repeat your previous order. This time, the hauler blossoms into an explosion of flame and debris. There are no survivors. Your Commodore will later acknowledge your actions and treat it as a highlight reel of a sports game, but nothing of great import. But here on Earth, an act like that sparks a debate about international law and rules of war, and it sparked a question in my head. How much does the Imperium care about war crimes? Now to preface this, I have no intention of getting into real-world politics. It was just a topical event that made this a relevant question to ask. And considering I'm not monetized, this is the best time to talk about it. So the whole point of war crimes is throughout history, nations have agreed through both spoken and unspoken rules that allow them to fight wars without unnecessary damage to structures, civilians, and the environment. The reasons behind are a mix of moral and practical, with the sentiment being that once the war ends, you have to rebuild the parts of the nation that were subjected to the war. And you can't do that when an excessive amount of civilians are dead, service buildings are destroyed, and the survivors are pissed because of the previous reasons, among the plethora of other terrible shit that happens in war. So there needs to be a deterrence to nations from committing these crimes that all nations agree are crimes, so it can be shown to all nations there will be equal enforcement. Now that's the super simplified version, and there have been nations that have disregarded the rules, and we'll mention that later. The Imperium has 1,000,000 worlds, and each world has its own planetary defense force that are subjected to their own rules on top of imperial law. But we're going to focus on the Astra Militarum, as we can view the PDF as the National Guard and the Astra Militarum as the quote-unquote professional army. I have to make the distinction now, as it can muddy the waters of what is seen as acceptable in combat. Speaking of acceptable, let's list off the highlight reel of what our world, based on the Hague Treaty, Geneva Convention, and Rome ICC, consider war crimes. We've got murder, torture, sexual violence, attack on civilians, using chemical weapons, forced displacement, pillaging, attacks on protected objects, denying fair trial to potential war criminals, compelling service by prisoners of war, bio-warfare, indiscriminate attacks, no child soldiers, attacks on peacekeepers, starvation as a method of warfare, human shields, environmental destruction, attacks on medical personnel and facilities, unlawful deportation, denial of humanitarian assistance, complicity in war crimes, attacks on journalists and media personnel, recruitment of combatants by force or fraud, cultural cleansing, and compulsory labor. Right off the bat, I need to put these in 3 groups. Things the Guard don't care about, things where there's nuance, and things that are hardline war crimes in the Guard's eyes. These are as follows, and feel free to comment if you think I miscategorized any of them. The ones I think the Guard don't care about: chemical weapons, bioweapons, forced displacement, unlawful deportation, compulsory labor, recruitment of combatants by force or fraud, denial of humanitarian assistance, attacks on media and journalists, starvation as a method of warfare, attacks on peacekeepers, and human shields. Chem weapons and bioweapons are obvious, as they use them pretty extensively. Forced displacement and unlawful deportation are irrelevant, and as typically being displaced is the better of the options. There are no laws regarding deportation as far as I'm aware, and if you see what is on the other side, you begin off planet side if you can help it. Compulsory labor happens. Recruitment of combatants by force or fraud happens through military actions to enforce imperial ties. Denial of humanitarian assistance doesn't really happen, as humanitarian assistance isn't too prevalent. Attacks on media and journalists. Starvation as a method of warfare is practical in the Imperium's eyes. Attacks on peacekeepers doesn't technically apply, as we view peacekeeping forces as UN soldiers, and that's not a thing in the Imperium. Human shields is irrelevant, as most enemies would give 0 shits about civilians, so there's no incentive to even use this tactic. Now we can move on to the ones that are more nuanced. attacks on protected objects facilities, attacks on medical personnel facilities, pillaging, deny and throw trials, indiscriminate attacks, no child soldiers, cultural cleansing, environmental destruction, and compelling service by prisoner of war. Attacks on protected objects and facilities, and attacks on medical personnel and facilities are where things get muddy, as you'll see hard rules against specific buildings such as shrines and other facilities of the Ecclesiarch, and to some extent Mechanicus. However, if sufficient evidence can be presented that these sites are corrupted beyond any practical means of re-sanctification, or said corruption can lead to a breach of operational control for guard forces, then it's applicable to use force to destroy these buildings. Regarding attacks on medical personnel facilities, it's more in lines of practicality, and a lot of instances of guard using force is to gain compliance or liberate the world. In either sense, it's safe to assume the guard is more willing to capture medical facilities intact to use them for their forces or loyal forces on the planet, as opposed to destroying them outright. Pillaging depends on who is being pillaged. Steal personal ship from the enemy you kill, A-OK, minus some chaos ship, we'll ignore that. But steal something from the loyal civilian population of the planet you're stationed on, and you can end up paying from the street lamps. You could see that happening to the Savlar Kim dogs in Shadowsword. So again, stealing in and of itself isn't the issue, it's who you steal from. Denying fair trials. It's very much in the eye of the commissar. Typically, if a war crime or crime in general is committed in the guard, a trial is held with the commissars acting as judiciary staff. They then review evidence, determine guilt, and perform sentencing. And it's surprisingly fair. If sufficient evidence can be presented in support of the defense, the commissars can render an innocent verdict. Suffice it to say, if a commissar in the field can articulate it, they can just straight up kill you in the field and call it a day. Indiscriminate attacks only really applies in instances of liberation where loyal civilians are in the area, and even then, if a threat appears severe enough, it is not necessarily a line in the sand. No child soldiers is followed in a sense as you're considered an adult at 15, which, quick side note, that's the same age limit as our world, which is nuts when you consider that means you can't drive, smoke, drink, vote, watch rated R movies, purchase firearms, knives, paints, glues, etc. But you can be in the army to kill people. Cultural cleansing applies to Imperium Mechanicus culture, though again, if extenuating circumstances permit, there is some lateral movement here. You can start to see a trend. Environmental destruction is a factor based on if military high command and planetary governors care for whatever reasons. Otherwise, not really a problem. Compelling service by prisoner of war is generally frowned upon, as you don't want troops who are your enemy to have weapons, when surely you could find personnel that would be more quote-unquote willing to fight. However, there are times where desperate measures have to have been taken, and this is more of a you could, but not quite should. Let's move on to the red lines. Murder, torture, sexual violence, attacks on civilians, complicity in war crimes. The red lines can be summed up pretty quickly. These practically all apply to civilians of the Imperium and will be enforced severely, with 8 applying to any and all instances. As to put it in a restrained manner, any sexual act to those tinged with chaos or xenos is viewed as negatively as bestiality, and you will be put down like the beast you are. As we know, when it comes to guard regiments, they all come with a commissar. Memes aside, they aren't just there to shoot a guardsman because they look like retreating, but they are truly the enforcers of discipline. If a guardsman murders a civilian of the Imperium, the commissar is well within his duties to execute that guardman, as killing that civilian takes away a subject of the Emperor who could have performed a duty that helps the Imperium. But more importantly, they are the diplomats that ensure the guardsmen of their regiment not only adhere to guard regulations, but any customs that come with the world they're operating in. That's the interesting part, because not only are guardsmen sent to hostile worlds to conquer or liberate, they can also be sent to Imperial worlds to assist the PDF that is being overwhelmed. This turns into a balancing act, as the planetary governor needs the guard for their quality and equipment, but the guard needs the planetary governor for assistance on the ground with things like facilities, intelligence, and even supplies to an extent. But let's get to the real point of the video. How is the Imperium able to essentially enforce a huge chunk of rules that, while we consider them outright war crimes, they have extensive amounts of leeway in how they prosecute war? The answer is 2 parts. 1, the stakes for failure are significantly higher. Touching back on the book Shadowsword, it was shown how one unsanctioned psyker left alone in a politically charged environment would lead to the planet being on the cusp of a demon infestation. Whereas we have rules to reduce collateral damage and help maintain civilian life, any restrictions on the prosecution of military actions could result in all civilians dying. and the collateral damage being worldwide, or hell, even system-wide, with threats like the Tyranid and Orc Wars. Case in point was, in the Gaunt's book His Last Command, they discovered there were going to be massive chaos gates, and as a result, they stopped caring that they were on a holy world and just opted to bomb the ever-living shit out of it. This dovetails into the second part. Who is going to enforce these infractions? Because guess what? If a Lord Commissar or worse and Inquisitors in the area, they can raise and lower the bar at a whim. And it doesn't matter, by and large, if the world they're on cares. A planetary governor can have their power negated if the ranking commissar in the world enacts martial law. And when that happens, they typically have the guard to enforce that rule, overriding any resistance the local PDF could muster. So it doesn't matter if the governor raises hell about the guard burning forests, bombing cities, and displacing civilians, because if the right person gives the go-ahead, the guard is free to act as it wishes. There's actually a third part that I forgot to even mention, and that's the fact that when you're not a human race, it doesn't matter. It doesn't apply. You are not human, therefore you're not worth the shit on my boot. A huge part of this video is really just talking about Imperium, dealing with rebels, dealing with people possibly turning to chaos, just very man versus man, because that's where it would make sense for rules to apply. But when it comes to Eldar, Necrons, Orcs, Tau, it doesn't matter because you're not human. There might be some rules if, like, say there's gonna be a small agreement between like the Tau or maybe the Eldar, but even then it's not a big issue. The only time they're going to enforce it if you cause military high command or inquisitors inconveniences. I wish I could talk more about how we get away with doing stuff to other species, races, whatever you want to call it, but I mean, it is. In a universe where if it's not your race, it doesn't matter. We don't care. The sky is the limit to what we can do to you. That's not a stretch from reality either. Where the military commits actions, there are certainly gray. Case in point as well, any major war. The Australians were allowed to use human shields on trains in the Boer War in Africa until it was no longer politically convenient for the British Empire. There's a Laconia incident in World War II in which Allied forces were the cause and received medals instead of punishment. Hell, even the Highway of Death in the Gulf War, where retreating vehicles, many of which civilian vehicles, were destroyed with the occupants killed. When you look at these instances, some will be condoned, others condemned. I'm not here to say which you should do. Rather highlight the point that the winning side gets to dictate if any wrongdoings happened. Even now, with the US blowing up boats and arresting a president through military force, it comes down to they can because no one else can enforce international rules. When you are the leader economically, militarily, and diplomatically, congratulations, the rules are as much of a problem as you allow them to be. And the Imperium has this exact view and enacts this mentality judiciously. Again, I'm not here to say it's right or wrong, it just is. Might makes right, and when you're the only one who can enforce the rules, you define the rules. What makes this video hard is that, aside from the red lines for the guard that I mentioned, you really can't compare what the guard does versus what our world does, because like I said, with the guard, a lot of that stuff just feels more justified. Again, it's like, oh, if I don't indiscriminately bomb this neighborhood that has Tyranids in it, it's just more biomass for the Tyranids. Oh, hey, if I don't destroy this world that has the Necrons on it, the Necrons are going to be a real problem. So it's real easy just to go, yeah, they're going to do a lot of inhumane shit, but I get it. You don't get that much in our world. So many instances of like some of the most heinous shit you see, it's done almost just cuz. And the worst part is, like, some of the instances are the worst, like say Japan with China or Italy with Ethiopia. We just kind of forgave and forget because of political reasons. We needed them more as a friend than an enemy, so we weren't going to be as harsh with prosecuting those war crimes. You don't see that much in Warhammer because there's almost no political need to look the other way, because militarily, whatever you did was more likely justified to begin with. The only reason it would be a problem is if you had some like high-level ecclesiarchs or mechanics or inquisitors or whoever the fuck, where they had their own personal political beliefs and they just abused their power to get their way. But overall, in like the military on the ground, it's really hard to compare. The main difference between our world versus the Imperium is the Imperium is willing to imprison and execute those who commit war crimes. In our world, it is very rare for a nation to imprison their own troops for war crimes, even more rare to use capital punishment. That's the biggest irony. The Imperium is much more lenient on what they consider a war crime, but by the Emperor, if you commit one, it will be the last thing you do. Thank you for watching. This one might be a spicier video, but again, I feel like people don't realize that the Imperium does view some things as war crimes and responds as such, while also showing the concept of the strong does what they can is a universal concept that doesn't only apply to the 40k setting. So again, I hope I did a good job at least explaining to you why there's a difference between how the Imperium looks at war crimes versus we do. And with that slightly depressing thought, I'll see you next time out in the warp.